Juan Rivera confessed to a crime he didn't commit, and the mistake wasn't the confession itself, it was believing that confessions are reliable. Confessions feel final. They feel like the end of a story. When someone admits guilt, it creates a sense of closure for investigators, for the public, and for the system itself. But psychologically, confessions are often not the end of a story. They're the beginning of a much larger mistake. In 1992, 11-year-old Holly Staker was found murdered in Waukegan, Illinois. The crime shocked the community, and investigators faced immediate pressure to find answers. There were no clear suspects, no eyewitnesses, and no physical evidence that immediately pointed to a perpetrator. Pressure like that doesn't just affect suspects, it affects investigators as well. When a case feels urgent, the system naturally looks for certainty. And certainty often looks like a confession, even when no evidence supports it. Juan Rivera became the focus of the investigation and was questioned for hours. There was no physical evidence tying him to the crime, but there was something else present: exhaustion, stress, and the psychological desire for the situation to end. Under prolonged pressure, the human brain prioritizes escape over accuracy. That doesn't require guilt, it only requires stress. At a certain point, a confession can feel less like an admission and more like a way out. The critical mistake in this case was how that confession was treated. Investigators didn't treat it as a hypothesis, something to be tested. They treated it as confirmation. A hypothesis is questioned. Confirmation is protected. Once a confession exists, every new piece of information is interpreted through the lens of that confession. The confession doesn't end the investigation, it narrows it. Confessions are persuasive because they feel voluntary. Most people assume that someone wouldn't admit to something they didn't do.
Why would you confess? I don't care who you are. If I am getting, charged with murder, I'm not going to confess to something I did not do and then explain the whole night and how I did it and why I did it and everything like that if I didn't do it, It just doesn't make no sense,
But that assumption ignores how people actually behave under pressure. Stress, fear, fatigue, and authority can all produce admissions that have nothing to do with guilt. The public hears certainty. The system hears closure. Psychology hears stress. Under extreme stress, the brain's ability to reason and plan becomes impaired, while threat response systems take over. Short-term relief begins to matter more than long-term consequences. In that state, agreeing can feel safer than resisting. Psychologists generally describe 3 categories of false confessions. Voluntary false confessions happen when people admit to crimes without coercion, often driven by attention, guilt over unrelated issues, or a desire to protect someone else. Compliant false confessions occur when someone confesses to escape an interrogation environment. The confession is a means to end the pressure. Persuaded false confessions happen when individuals begin to doubt their own memory after prolonged questioning and suggestion. Juan Rivera's case fits squarely in the second category. In the United States, many interrogations have historically relied on techniques designed to elicit confessions rather than gather information. When the focus shifts from understanding what happened to securing an admission, the risk of false confessions increases. This isn't about malicious intent, it's about how systems behave under pressure, just like people do. Research into wrongful convictions has repeatedly shown that false confessions are not rare anomalies. They tend to emerge in situations involving prolonged questioning, psychological pressure, and the absence of safeguards. Years later, DNA evidence excluded Juan Rivera entirely. Physical evidence doesn't argue, persuade, or rationalize. It simply exists. And when physical evidence contradicts a confession, one of them has to give way. Juan Rivera spent nearly 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. This wasn't a failure of one person. It wasn't even a failure of intent. It was a failure of an assumption. The belief that confessions are inherently reliable. Some jurisdictions have since moved towards interview models that emphasize information gathering over confession seeking. What's notable isn't just that these approaches are less coercive, it's that they tend to produce more reliable information. Another important safeguard is recording entire interrogations from start to finish. Transparency changes behavior. When questioning is subject to review, coercive practices become harder to justify. If you're interested in understanding how these mistakes happen and why they feel reasonable at the time, consider subscribing. This channel exists to explain how psychology shapes real cases. What feels like certainty is often just stress. What looks like closure might only be the beginning of a tragedy.